Hey everybody, Jack here at the beginning of the show just to really quickly say two things. One, and the most important of which, the Dodgers did go on to win the World Series. God bless the Dodgers. There was a classic Yankees meltdown. Oh, what a shame it would be to be a Yankees fan right about now. Real shame. That's the whole country's torn up about it. And number two, Dan and I had a bunch of technical difficulties for this episode. We don't usually have them. This is like one of the first times in like 3 years we've actually had technical difficulties. I fucked up. I wasn't recording through my actual microphone. That's a shame. What are you going to do? So my audio is a bit kind of screwy for this one. You can still hear it. It's still fine. Dan just sounds way better. You will hear Dan at one point say, I don't think you're recording into your microphone in the first like 20 seconds of this episode, to which I curtly respond, no, don't worry about it. I'm sure I am. Turns out I in fact was not, so that's a shame. My audio is a bit screwy for this one. What are you gonna do? We've done like 122 of these. Every now and then we're gonna fuck up. Enjoy the episode.
Eat a few more stale crisps.
Eat a few more stale crisps.
Water. Hello, Jack.
Hello, Dan. Technical difficulties for the first time. Well, not ever in the show, but very rarely have I ever had technical difficulties. So, yeah,
So another thing, I'm using a really crappy pair of headphones. So I want you to just double check that you're recording through your microphone.
yeah, I should do that. I'm confident.
But it wasn't.
Right, good.
You know what? Fuck it. At this point, we're recording like almost 2 hours.
So I
after
just
when we were
realized how
supposed to.
blurry. Oh god, this.
You know what? I'm not saying anything of any worth this
It's great.
episode, so you know what? It's fine.
Yeah. We weren't expecting much anyway.
Yeah, you know. We didn't read a whole book, though.
Right.
Dan, one thing I didn't mention to you. Very, very big world historic event coming up. Hopefully this week. Hopefully not next week. I'm not referring to the American election.
No.
I am, of course, referring to the fact that tonight the Dodgers are 100% going to win the World Series. So that's all I'm saying. I'm like, I got to stay up all night tonight. I got to go to work tomorrow, first thing tomorrow morning. I got a bunch of shit I got to do. But there's no other way. I must stay up all night and watch it.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we read some communizer shit. The Dodgers are winning the World Series. I'm in a good mood.
It's going to be a good day. It's going to be a good
It's gonna
day.
be a good day.
I had no idea. This is something I've missed out on.
Yeah.
Missed out on your reports from you as to how the Dodgers are faring.
Well, you know, I mean, pretty much the entire playoffs, I'm pretty sure, since the last time we talked, have begun and they're just about to end because the Dodgers are
Have they just won? Are they sweeping it or whatever the phrase is?
It took them a while. No one gives a shit about this. They beat the Padres in an incredibly dramatic
We
series.
should have talked about this before.
What are you going to do? Then they beat the Mets, which, whatever, the Mets, who cares? And now they're going to sweep the Yankees because the Yankees are the most down bad baseball team anybody has ever seen in history. And it's a real shame for all of our Yankees fan listeners. But what are you going to do? Sucks.
Very sad.
Very sad.
Well, good luck.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. We were like, should we say anything about the American election? Because we're recording this the Tuesday before the American election. Both of us decided, don't know what we'd actually have to add. Maybe we'll talk about it next time we go to record when we know the actual outcome.
I remember, but what I do remember is having a chat with you about the last presidential election on like episode 2 or 3 or something.
Wow, I don't remember that. That's funny.
I mean, we didn't talk about it exactly. It was just, it was have you voted? Yeah, I voted. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
How do we feel about that? You know, whatever. Yeah.
Oh, God, I hate to think what
Anyway.
We've been doing this show for 4
It's the
years.
passage of time. Yeah, that's what I'm drawing attention to.
I was under the impression it was 3 years. That's weird. Well, I'm just a bit of an idiot. If there's one thing I learned in 2016, though, Dan, just don't make political predictions because it's kind of like you can if you want to, and everybody wants to hear a prediction, but don't maybe make predictions. Just don't stake your well-being on it. Is what I learned because I made that mistake in 2016. Well-being was worse.
So what you're saying is make predictions but don't mean it? Is that all?
Make predictions but don't like
be invested.
tie your yeah. Well, I mean it's hard not to be invested, I guess. So.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, well, what I realized was when we were talking beforehand was that, yeah, basically I just want it to not happen.
Yep.
I don't want to live in a world
Cool.
post next Tuesday.
Yes.
But I guess I'm going to have to.
Hey, well, the good thing is that for the next week, we're living in a pre-next Tuesday world.
Yes.
So we got that to look forward
to.
Right. Oh, dear.
Yeah, we are recording on a Tuesday.
We are. The Tuesday that the Dodgers win the World Series, as it will be henceforward known. Oh man, I'm gonna look like a real idiot when the Yankees come back and win 4 games in a row. But we all know that's
never gonna happen.
Never gonna happen. Looking at that Yankees team, Dan, I'm 100% put your bets in. Not gonna happen. Dan, we read some communizer stuff. Not openly communizer. I don't know if we can necessarily add him to the list, but
I don't know what it takes to be an open communizer. But I suppose you have to use the phrase or be writing in endnotes.
Yeah, exactly. Theory communist or something like that. This book, I didn't know anything about Joshua Clover, and I'd only vaguely heard about this book. Like, when did it even come out? It came out in
2015, I think.
Yeah, 2016. A fateful year. A fateful year. Yeah, I'd never really engaged with it too much. I didn't actually realize. I kind of just figured the guy, when I just heard about it in the past, that the guy would have been a Occupy type, which maybe actually was an Occupy type. That's neither here nor there. Was not expecting it to kind of be what it is, which is in the same vein as Phil Neal, Gilles Dauvet, Theory Communiste kind of people. Definitely running in those same circles, it would seem. The test for that, which we've mentioned on the show before, is how quickly does it take a text before they cite the coming insurrection. And in this text, it's 4 pages, which I thought was incredibly funny. But overall, I enjoyed it. We obviously spoke about this when we talked to Viv a couple weeks/months ago. And yeah, I for the most part enjoyed reading it. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. It's a history text which we love, and it's political economy which we love, and it's got a fun. It's got a concise argument which it makes somewhat clearly. So yeah, and the whole. Well, what it does is it sort of without getting into too much detail, which we'll get into in a minute, sort of makes a proposition for an unfolding series of historical events, creates a piece of theoretical analysis to describe the history of capitalism in the form of popular resistance to capitalism and the effects of capitalism and the agents of capitalism, in the form of a very compelling and interesting dialectical process. So it's all the good things.
It's all the good things. It's got it. One thing that I think works with it and against it, as with all of these texts, is kind of the language with which it is which it is written. Yeah. It's
potentially verbose in places, perhaps.
Verbose, kind of flowery, but I think that's kind of the thing that makes a lot of this stuff fun. It's you read endnotes, you read Phil Neal and stuff like that. It's very dramatic. It's very it's got a flair for for the poetic, which is cool. Part 3 of this book did kind of wind up trying to be a little bit crazy because it leaned into that a lot. It kind of felt like the classic Verso books being pad it out, Joshua, pad it out. But
it felt long for what it was trying to say. I really appreciate what it was trying to say. And we did also decide that we could probably just read this whole book and make one episode out of it, because it probably is concise enough of an argument that we can just sort of have a single episode chat about it. But that did lead to some exasperated skim reading of said slightly flowery language, which is quite difficult to do.
Well, it's also difficult to read a little bit. It's as with all of this stuff, it can be hard to understand what is actually being said. And I think I blame the French for this. And what I mean by that is that the communization stuff, all of these kind of ultra left currents, unless I'm incorrect, kind of stemmed from situationism and stuff like that, and different forms of French politics. There's a reason Dauvet and Theory Communiste and all of these things are at the forefront, or at least at one point were at the forefront of this kind of politics. And I think in those French academic circles, you're really encouraged to kind of come up with phrases and words that help to define and to create like a new idea for your argument, right? So that's where you get things like maybe not thingification, but like what's a good example? Like oh, I had one in my head. What was it? It's like an event, right? Like that's the kind of classic one where it's like, you create a word to kind of describe this idea that you could probably just describe in a different way, but you want it to be like an idea because then you get recognized in French academia. I think that there's a lot of that in here. So like there's one page where there are two sentences. This is kind of the type of language that we're dealing with, where you're just kind of like, what is being said here? One of the sentences ends, beginning the way that riots often do in the age of riot prime, not out of nowhere, but out of everywhere. Another sentence where it's like the freeways and thoroughfares were the closest matter to hand of, and then in italics, it all of the anti-human totalization and thingification of the world. And it's like, yeah, okay, right. Like part of me appreciates that. I do like that it's attempting to not just be a like dry academic text, but at a certain point, it feels like I'm having to think about certain things a bit too much, and it's like, oh, what are you just trying to say here? Let's just get to the point.
Yeah, I'm a dyslexic that finds it incredibly difficult to read poetry in the best of times. If you're going to try and sort of merge academic texts with poetic language, like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Play by the rules, please. Play by the rules.
Yeah. Give us some spark notes, please. Yeah. But okay, enough of the kind of hassling of that. This is actually a very, very good book. I think that we'll probably get in towards the end of this episode to some criticisms that we might have of it. But on the whole, the argument that is being put forward here, not only do I find like really refreshing, but I think I find it like actually probably just pretty correct. It's the political implications of what he's saying that are maybe a bit more like up to interpretation because it is his interpretation of what he's talking about. But on the whole, again, like, yeah, I think that what he's saying is pretty good. And he's drawing from a lot of sources that we have kind of come across and appreciated before. And he's kind of merging them into new ideas. And I was kind of like, seems good to me. That's kind of how it always is with this stuff, right? With the kind of like ultra left stuff. You're kind of reading and you're nodding along and you're going, this is pretty good. Love it. And then it's like, if they get to the end and you're like,
take the
what?
leap of faith.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, why did I just read this? But anyways, it is very good. Mm-hmm. So I was trying to figure out where we should start. Should we start with kind of like the Arrighi Brenner stuff, or should we start with like just defining strikes and riots? What do you think?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because there's a lot of like, you basically get the whole argument at the beginning, and then it unfolds in greater detail through the book. So then it's quite difficult to know, well, where is the start point for an unfolding argument. I suppose one of the places he does start is with adopting a definition of riot, which he takes from historian E.P. Thompson. And obviously, like, this is as I say, a sort of historical text where he's analysing the sort of forms of political resistance that have happened through the history of capitalism. And his general proposition is that in the early stages of the transition into capitalism, as a result of the social upheaval that comes about with the sort of unrooting of the traditional social structures of feudalism, the new dominance of the market in people's lives, you get spontaneous, seemingly appropriate forms of resistance to that new paradigm. He defines that through reading Thompson and other sort of like historians of the period as being defined primarily by rioting. But he's quite keen to set a definition for riot which doesn't focus on the potentially violent aspects of riot, which let's use a phrase that we like to use, like a bourgeois theoretician or like your lay sort of like understanding of the phrase riot would jump straight to the idea of a sort of violent, potentially quite spontaneous, sort of like almost libidinal kind of like happening that wasn't particularly like structured or political or didn't have a well-defined causes, rather than focusing on that sort of like tactical aspect of the sort of like how a riot might be experienced by people witnessing or people that are suffer its wrath, I suppose. He takes from E.P. Thompson a definition of riot that's defined in relation to the marketplace and the sort of central place of the market in new capitalism or in nascent capitalism, and sort of talks about it as an intervention into the distribution of goods. So they usually take the form of like a bread riot or blockading of a port potentially to prevent a commodity that's needed in a local area from being exported by like a mercantile capitalist or whatever. So yeah, his sort of initial definition of riot is that of like is one focused on the area of distribution of commodities and motivated by the necessities of the everyday reproduction of sort of like social life. And that's a sort of definition that he's going to come back to and rehabilitate when he comes back to talk about riot at the end of the book, I suppose, having transitioned through a discussion of the sort of like industrial revolution and the high water mark of the traditional social democratic labor movement and labor strikes and that kind of thing. But
yeah, when we get to Riot Prime,
this
time
you know,
it's
well,
personal.
that was took me such a long time to work out whether there was any reason to to use that terminology other than to sort of like mimic Marx, you know. But what is that? Like, yeah,
we'll get there.
There's so many sentences that start like this is what defines Riot Prime, you know. This is right.
I underlined like 10 different definitions of Riot Prime, and I was like, wait a minute, hang on, what's going on here? Yeah, so it's very interesting. It's exactly what you're saying. He's kind of trying to push back against these typical understandings that people have of what a riot is, and he's trying to basically say riots at certain phases in capitalism's development are the predominant form that class struggle on behalf of the working class, or the proletariat, I should say, unfolds. Now, we'll kind of get on to the different phases in the framework for these phases, these cyclical phases that he talks about here in a second. What causes the kind of content, or maybe I should say the form. I was kind of trying to figure this out. Is it like a content or form thing that's going on in the changing of the working class like tactics around their like rebellions? Maybe we can get onto that later. But yeah, he's basically saying that at some points it's the riot and at other points it's the strike. And like I said, before we get onto that framework, maybe I'll just run through. There's like a paragraph in there where he says, you know, here's what a riot is and here's what a strike is. And helpfully it is all in the introduction. I read the introduction and then I was like, maybe we should just finish this whole book because this is like just the entire book right here. But he basically says that riots, exactly as you're saying, unfold in the sphere of circulation of capital. They're a struggle to set prices in the market. The people involved in them are unified solely by their dispossession, and they're building towards a commune or something, which classic, love that. Whereas he says strikes unfold in the context of production. They're a struggle to set the price of labor power, and there's kind of a relationship between real and formal subsumption in this kind of shift that we'll get onto. The people involved in strikes are unified by their shared worker identity. They're all engaging in a strike as workers. And if you know anything about the kind of like French ultra-left school, alarm bells are going to be going off because it's like, that's not what we want in our class struggle. And for him, he says that it affirms capital, whereas the riot does the opposite. It's everybody who's dispossessed by capital, not just the workers, and it doesn't affirm capital. It, as I said, seems to negate it in some sense. Perhaps that's reading a bit too much into it. We'll get on to it. Like I said, I'm kind of on board with him, even up to this point. But
I sort of thought there was a degree of affirmation of the system in Riot, as just described as like associated with the early phase of capitalism, at least in the sense that the thing seemingly motivating the rioters is the idea that there is a correct price for commodities, and there is a correct consumer for commodities. There should be an established price, the one that people are able to pay, and the accepted consumer ought to be the people in the immediate vicinity of where the thing is being produced, should be the people that use it. Now, maybe if that is the case, and it is seemingly an affirmation of that new capitalist system, maybe it's, as you say, it's a hallmark of that process of formal consumption, whereby we're still caught in the boundary space between feudalism and capitalism, where the old peasants, the new proletariat, have been sort of like dispossessed of their ability to produce for themselves and are now subject to market forces, but either haven't quite reckoned with what market forces means, but also the capitalist class haven't yet started to fully sort of carry out the real subsumption of the world into the capitalist form, in the sense of
I think you're right. I think probably what I was maybe more so describing was Riot Prime. Although maybe, like, you got me thinking, because maybe it's like it depends on the context of the given riots, because like early riots, I mean, because like if there was a shared cultural memory of the correct price or whatever of that good, then maybe you can make an argument that it doesn't. But then that would be kind of like a reactionary kind of like, as Marxists, we like a good teleological explanation of history, so don't try and put the brakes on. But yeah. He talks about some bread riots and port blockades that took place in England pretty early on, like King's Lynn or King's Lane riots or something like that, as being ones that were being definitely kind of like against capital, right? And this kind of like new thing. Whereas some kind of later riots were exactly as you're saying. I thought that was really interesting, actually, when he was like, these riots were kind of just part of the market themselves. They like riots themselves, far from being like this boogeyman that shows up to like shake capital to its core. They're actually like regulators of market prices. I thought that was fascinating. That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, maybe jumping ahead, but I don't suppose it really matters. One of the definitions that I did manage to sort of fix in my head of this distinction between Riot and Riot Prime is the idea that under this phase of Riot, the rioters are in very direct contact with the market. They're able, basically what they're doing is setting the price. I mean, in some cases they're setting the price at zero, right? But for Clover, that's still a process of like a market intervention to set the price contrary to what the capitalist market says perhaps it might be, or rather maybe it's not a capitalist price, maybe it's not a market price that's being charged, maybe it's just an inflated one for whatever reason. And then, and under conditions of riot, the rioters are in very close proximity to the market. But at this point in time, there really is no state to speak of. There's no police force. There's a limited army. Whereas, and under conditions of Riot Prime, he goes on to say, well, those conditions are flipped, right? And now rioters are reconciling themselves with a global market that's so incredibly far away. It's very hard to comprehend how any of these commodities are moving, or how to find a way to engage with them or change it in any way. But what they are in very visceral contact with is the state in the form of the police.
Yeah,
I say that now just because it came into my head, but
absolutely. It's all of the like violent arms of the state. That's I think that is kind of one of his main definitions in it, and it's interesting because I feel like that comes directly from the coming insurrection, right? Where there's the famous part in that book where they say something along the lines of, like rioters show up in the middle of in the downtown of their cities, hoping to like be confronted with the face of capital, because that's what they're all told, and all they find are just empty buildings. Which, again, it's that kind of like very like flowery, poetic way of making what I think is actually a really good point, which is like people aren't able to confront, the core of capitalism anymore, where commodities are being made so much as in places like the United States and in like Western Europe. They're confronting the state, obviously, but also like logistics corridors, which is kind of where, when we read Phil Neal's book Hinterland, kind of where he actually finds hope, right? Where he's like, actually, hey, maybe there's something here. Joshua Clover actually kind of goes on in this book to kind of criticize different theories of organizing and strategizing around these kind of like logistics corridors in a really interesting way. But again, maybe we'll just get on with that. But yeah, it's very good stuff. Should we get into the periodization stuff now? We've never read any Origi for the show. This is making me feel like we should read some Origi. Google Giovanni Origi. But basically, and again, this is all stuff that we talked about with Viv when we read his essay on this about Marxism as science. But Joshua Clover here is pulling from Origi's tripartite theory of crisis and just of capitalism in general, basically saying that crises and the development of capitalism unfold cyclically. And you can point to very specific, like long durays of capitalism, whether they're long centuries or short centuries or whatever, where you can find this cycle constantly happening. And basically, the three parts of it are an industrial phase, or actually, I suppose the beginning of it is based around circulation, where there's merchant capital investing into industrial capital, building up industrial capacity. That gets into the industrial part of this whole cycle, which is part two, where capitalism is dominated by industrial capital. And then again, through just general Marxist crisis theory, whether that's a fall or a rise in the organic composition of capital, we get to another phase of capitalism dominated by circulatory capital, which is where capitalism is no longer really able to valorize and to realize its investments in industry. So it's forced to look into spheres of circulation to find profit, whether that's, really boosting productivity up to like a maximum point where it doesn't really make sense to produce any more commodities, or whether it's kind of price fixing or different things like this. And then eventually what's happened up until this point is that the cycle builds itself up over again because capitalism is able to find either a part of the world that is a rising industrial nation or part of the world, just region to invest in, or, and it doesn't go into this in the book, but also maybe there's just a war that just destroys and devalues so much fixed capital that it's able to reinvest in that part of the world. And that's kind of, according to Origi and according to Clover, how capitalism has always been able to rescue itself from the cyclical crisis of circulatory capital, industrial capital, circulatory capital. And yeah, the whole point of the book is that perhaps not anymore.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's funny, isn't it? Because what Clover has done is sort of adapted that, but actually created just one cycle. And rather than one that's somehow cyclical, I suppose it's not even a cycle for him. I think it is a dialectical process of overcoming, I suppose. But yeah, that it seems I don't know how much weight I put behind this. Well, the way Clover describes Origi's definition is to sort of say, well, to split the MC M prime formula in two and say, okay, so that first there's a portion of the sort of the MC portion of the equation where, as you say, capitalism is in something of a boom and it's possible to make profit in the realm of production, and then you get all the sort of investment in traditional industrial sectors, I suppose, and then it falls into crisis and you get that financialization process. I mean, what's really interesting about this argument is what Clover is doing to say, okay, how does this affect materially the conditions for resistance, and tying the effectiveness of a strategy to the particular situation under which, or the sort of like general healthfulness of the capitalist mode of production. Something that I'm not sure whether we came across it when we read Fossil Capital, because there was quite a lot of discussion of the effectiveness of 19th century sort of like industrial strikes in that. But one thing that I did find really quite enjoy in this analysis is the idea that strikes are only effective when the threat of removing your labor really threatens the productivity of the place where you work and the profitability of that capitalist enterprise. A capitalist is under no particular impetus to yield to your demands if not having you working in his factory isn't actually losing anything. don't know why I gender them as a him, but like not losing them. And I'm imagining the sort of like 19th century top hat sort of like it doesn't really lose them all that much in the grand scheme of things, whereas under conditions whereby they're actually making a big profit on the commodities that they're making, then you threatening to remove your labor really is problematic to them. And obviously they are also making profits that can be redistributed to you, the worker.
That's something that I really find, I think, maybe one of the most compelling parts about this book. I don't know if it's been an argument that's been made elsewhere, but I first came to it at least when we talked about this a few episodes ago.
Mm-hmm.
That is that idea exactly of industrial action really only being successful in periods where capital is doing really well. And maybe one of the explanations for right now why there seems to be so much like energy for strike action, but not much is actually changing, and they're actually kind of like failing as soon as they start, or where they are succeeding, they're succeeding for moderate pay rises that are almost keeping up with inflation in certain key sectors of society, like, you know, train drivers or something like that. They're certainly not fucking succeeding in my workplace, but like, that's really fascinating. And it's premised on a bunch of different things, right? Like, it's also premised on the state having enough capital or at least money to just purchase a piece and just take that one on the chin, be like, don't worry, capitalists, we'll just pay for this one. Yeah. And it's particularly, I don't know, it feels like it has a lot of descriptive power in today's age where we're wondering, like, why isn't there a mass party? What, you know, like everyone is talking about now about how it seems to be capitalism, this thing called capitalism. There's everybody, you know, is talking about this and whatever, like, you know, weird version of, you know, whatever explanation of capital they want to have. But there's just no typical 20th century, early 20th century organizing around it. This seems to be a really good explanation to me because, you know, as I've seen in my workplace, when you do strike action, seems like bosses are more than happy to just be like, all right, well, we'll shut down for a few weeks and wait you out. Because what are you going to do? Not get paid for like a couple months? You can't afford that. And everybody just goes, yeah, you're right. And we just go back to work and accept our pay cuts, you know? Mm-hmm. So,
I mean, he also said something else in like the other side of this equation is under conditions of capitalist crisis, like neither you, the worker, nor the capitalist is ultimately served by your business going out of business. It's a terrible sentence, but you know what I'm trying to say. Like, and this sort of comes back to that critique of workerism by communizers, I guess, is the sense that under certain conditions, particularly under certain of capitalist crisis, I suppose, unionism and strike action, I guess what the communizers, the left communists call programmatism, actually only serves to like affirm the position of the worker as a worker in relation to the capitalist. Now, to his credit, like Clover says some similar things about the relation of the rioter to the police having like a mutually affirming relationship. Like, I think they don't necessarily escape that cycle as we're all stuck under the conditions in which we exist. You know, everybody's existing under capitalist conditions. But yeah, getting back to what I'm trying to say, like if under conditions of capitalist crisis, everybody in an enterprise really just wants to see that enterprise continue, because at least you're getting some kind of meager wage. It's better than not having the wage to rely on at all, I suppose.
Yeah, and you're right, and it's interesting because like you do see this in certain kind of like vulgarized circles around like Leninism, where the critique of capitalism seems to be one around rationality or irrationality, I should say, and like waste. And it's the idea of, God, if only we could put workers in charge, us workers in charge, we'd be able to manage everything really rationally. And it's like, that is not the point. It's like, it is not the point to like, obviously, yes, that's one of the like top three big problems with capitalism is how irrational and like potentially apocalyptic it is. But the point is like one around social relations, right? And it's one around like, you know, I suppose a certain amount of like negation of the category of worker and self-abolition. I kind of feel like all of that stuff is a little bit like, I don't know, I'm not, like a little bit like, yeah, okay, we got it. Yeah. The abolition of the worker, self-abolition. Okay, whatever. but you do understand at least what they're saying, right? Where it's like the point isn't to become enlightened workers. The point is to abolish class altogether. How it depends on who's kind of making this argument, I would say, and depends on how much stock I actually put into it, because just saying that I think means nothing if you don't actually understand what it is you're saying. I mean, there's a point at the end of this book where he doesn't. But
I mean, I guess the question is, what do you mean by that, and what form of strategy are you proposing? Like, how do you intend to abolish the worker as worker?
Yeah, because to a certain extent, it's also just like until you actually get to high communism, it's like it kind of is just like everybody is a worker, though. You know what I mean? It's just that everybody's labor is being treated equally. So it's not so much like I don't. We're getting into the weeds. I think we understand what we're saying. What are you gonna do? Let's get back to the good stuff, the historical periodization. So, he has Arrighi's framework here of the tripartite, investment into industrial capital making a shit ton of money, and then all of a sudden not being able to make any money, and having to go somewhere else to kind of start this whole process up again to save the world of capital, I guess. He then ties this in to Brenner's theory of the long downturn, which we've been trying to find something to read about Brenner's theory of the long downturn forever that isn't like a 400-page book that you can't buy. So if anybody has any essay length short explanations of Brenner's long downturn theory, send them our way. That would be great. But more or less what this is a claim that we're basically stuck, as the name suggests, in a long downturn, and as Clover says, we're stuck in a period of financialization and failing financialization. I would say he doesn't really get into kind of periodizing so-called neoliberalism, but one can infer from his argumentation here that neoliberalism is on its way out, if not already gone, because it's just kind of like there's nothing else you can privatize. Train tickets are already fucking £100 no matter where you go. So what else are you going to do? And basically, Brenner's whole thing here is that it's getting harder and harder, if not to the point where it's maybe going to just become impossible in most cases for profit to be realized on investment into production, because even though absolute profits for Fortune 500 companies or whatever are at all-time highs, the actual return on investment in these companies are dropping pretty quickly. And that is just because, again, of this kind of like tripartite theory of investment and of history that Arrighi is saying, but it's reached its so-called like logical conclusion and its sort of crisis where there's just a lot of capital and a lot of money sitting stagnant in bank vaults somewhere, or I suppose just little numbers on screens, that just cannot be reinvested back into production to make enough of a profit to warrant making that investment. This is like when you hear about like companies like Apple have like billions of dollars just sitting in like a bank somewhere. They're just like, well, I guess we'll just save that for a rainy day. You know what I mean? It's like, this is kind of Brenner's theory of the long downturn, which is that I don't know necessarily what Brenner would say. It is impossible now for capital to like save itself. Maybe there could be a regional war that just wipes out one continent and they're able to do it all again. But then I suppose you would say maybe nuclear weapons kind of like foreclose that possibility. One would certainly hope. So that's,
Yeah, I mean, Clover just sort of describes Brenner's and Arrighi's like theories of capitalist crisis, and they differ in a lot of ways from the one we sort of engage with most, which is the sort of idea of the tendential fall and the rate of profit, and like that theory of sort of final crisis or breakdown of capitalism. But all of these things do in their whatever sort of like theory of crisis is being proposed, I suppose to some extent what you propose as being the cause of the crisis does in some ways influence the possibility of escaping one, from our understanding of what it means to be in a potential in the conditions of a potential like final breakdown of capitalism. As you say, the what it would take to restart value production on a big enough scale to reinvigorate the capitalist economy, such that the healthfulness of capitalism can be restored under capitalism's own definition of what it means to be a functioning capitalist economy, i.e., having like 3+% growth every year or whatever. What it would take to get to that point is, as you say, like catastrophic. So yeah, like broadly agree from what I understand. Like, and to say then, like, I'd like to know more actually, because obviously what we're dealing with here is not a kind of like, okay, we get to 1973, we've ended sort of like functional commodity production capitalism, and now we're suddenly in financialization capitalism, and everything has changed. Actually, there is a transition phase between the two. You highlighted some of that process. Like what happens is there is this crisis of profitability. We have to find more profits. Obviously, neoliberalization comes along and like attempts to create new markets by selling off state assets in a lot of ways. So there is this process of attempting to manage the crisis. But then also what we're living through now is experientially for the proletariat, this process of becoming, of a greater and greater portion of the global proletariat becoming surplus to the needs of capitalism. And this is one of like Joshua Clover's like defining pieces of terminology that sort of spans throughout this whole book all the way from the initial phase of Riot that he describes through to Riot Prime, is this idea of like there permanently being a reserve, like a reserve army of laborers, a sort of surplus workers to fill in the gaps in the productive base when capitalism is in boom times and commodity production is good, and we're in a phase of strong industrial production of commodities. But in conditions of crisis, that surplus is that surplus population of workers is jettisoned from the production process, potentially never to return if capitalist productivity isn't to return also.
Yeah. A couple of things. It's funny, like, it's very odd that if all of this, crisis theory is correct, I mean, it seems like all of the descriptive elements of it are certainly correct. It's really, it always just blows my mind whenever I read about this stuff how much everything just seems to be converging all at once. I mean, the last episode we did was about the population crises that capitalism has. Every episode we talked about the climate crisis. It's just really interesting the way in which all of this stuff seems to be converging all at once, or all at once, maybe over the next 100 years or something like that. It's just weird. It's just like capitalism is like running out of like avenues for exploitation and for appropriation all at once, and it's just like, surely there's something there. Like, how is that just happening all of a sudden? It's very odd. And then it's also just like what you were saying just made me think about how we just see increasingly more and more unhinged attempts at profit taking among capitalists, right? Where it's like among financialization in the sphere of circulation, where somebody will come along and be like, but what about if we created a type of bond that was solely where we just traded really shitty mortgages? Surely that would help everybody. But I mean, I guess again, that's the problem with capitalism, is that everybody's in competition with each other. Nobody gives a shit about the wider system-wide ramifications, especially when nobody faces any jail time or any punishment whatsoever. So,
yeah, there's a sort of theory that everybody who used to be in commodity production is now attempting to work out how they can financialize those commodities, mostly in the form of like, okay, I'm not going to sell you this thing. Instead, I'm going to work out to rent it to you.
Exactly.
And then I'm going to hold a body of debt, and then I'm going to work out how I can trade that debt on whatever
that will never be
markets
fulfilled.
that will never be paid back or whatever.
Yeah.
Somebody else will buy it,
Yeah, not speaking from experience. Yeah. Well, I suppose let's get into that. We've kind of talked about all that. You made a good point about how he's definitely not trying to sell us on an abrupt system-wide change whenever there's, changes in this tripartite sequence or changes into this long downturn. He's saying this is like a process. It takes time. It doesn't just all of a sudden come out of nowhere. And he says the exact same thing for mapping strikes and riots as the dominant tactics of the working class, I suppose, onto those periods. So, obviously the riot maps onto periods where circulatory capital is, in ascension, and strikes are when capitalist accumulation in industrial sectors is doing really, really well. That's when you see, the proletariat trying to affirm itself, or the working class trying to affirm itself. But he in the historical descriptions of this book, he does a really good job of saying that the shift from riot to strike, and then from strike to riot prime, um, is also one in which there is a very gradual transition, and where you actually see a proliferation of tactics all existing at once as people try to, just in an uncoordinated way, figure out the best way to kind of, reproduce themselves, literally. And I thought that was really interesting. He describes how there's this weird phase around like the Luddites and different people like that, where you're kind of seeing like riot strikes and strike riots, where the working class is kind of like just, feeling its oats and figuring out what it can actually do in its capacity in the factories, where those kind of look like riots, but they're actually kind of like take the form more, or their content is maybe like a bit more strike heavy. And then one of the most interesting parts of this entire book is when he's describing the tactics of predominantly black neighborhoods and sectors of the proletariat in Detroit in the 1960s, where he kind of sketches out this really interesting portrait of strikes and riot prime kind of all existing at the same time, again, as people are trying to figure out how it is that they can, reproduce themselves socially in an incredibly hostile environment. And he makes the point there that in the 60s, there was obviously this great migration from the South of black families moving north. And he says that, Detroit went from having like a 5% black population to something like 45%, to now it's something like 80% or something like that. And he said the kind of conditions for this transitory phase in American history, in world history, I guess, is that there was a growing, I suppose you could say, like unemployed and maybe like lumpen element of the black population in Detroit, where they were just completely surplus to capitalist production, and they were living in extreme poverty and didn't necessarily have any prospects of, like, not even just like earning a decent wage, but even of employment in general. So you started to see something like riot prime developing there. While at the same time, there was still heavy industrial production in Detroit at that time, and you were still seeing like kind of the last gasps of industrial proletariat, like old school working class organization amongst like radical trade unions. And there's some really interesting points here where he describes how these different groups that were trying to organize these two, qualitatively different sections of the proletariat, the way that they interacted with each other. He talks about radical, like communist trade union organizations trying to organize the workers and butting heads with Black Panthers. He talks about how, elements in the Black Panthers were disagreeing with each other about why are we going after the lumpen proletariat? Why are we trying to encourage riots? While other members were like, of course we should be encouraging riots. It's an opportunity for people to just like get back at cops. It's really, really fascinating. And kind of like an element of, as I said, like the last gasp of kind of like maybe traditional 20th century workers' politics that was, identifiable on a quote unquote like world historical scale. It was really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's those moments where you see the transition happening, and then that he's able to draw out some of the contradictions in those moments, and yeah, it's interesting coming back to the idea of like form and content that you were bringing up before. Like there's a degree to which, like on the level of content, like well, I'm going to get them wrong. I'm going to stop saying form and content. on a certain surface level, particularly in the transition from like riot to strike, on a surface level, the tactics actually potentially look quite similar. But underlying that, there's this idea that he's drawing out that of a transition from workers, proletarians making a forceful political intervention in under conditions of riot. They're making that intervention into the realm of the circulation of commodities, whereas obviously as we move into sort of like 19th century industrialization and the building up of the first trade unions, and the sort of like factory industrial model, the intervention is made in the world of production itself. The concerns are the setting of the price of the value of the commodity labor rather than like consumer goods in the marketplace, but also like contestations over the length of the working day or the conditions of work or that kind of thing. But it's also interesting coming back to this sort of like distinction between like violent and non-violent aspects of these things. Like a conventional interpretation would say, okay, riots are a violent thing and strikes are like decent and above board and a sort of respectable democratic way of protesting certain things or attempting to get your needs met or whatever, which totally overlooks both the potentially destructive tactics employed by strike workers, but also the violence meted out by the forces of the state or capitalist employers against proletarians throughout history. He makes an interesting point that it's not a surprise that the strike adopts this sort of like sanctioned, above board, non-profit, non-violent sort of veneer, because we also see a political process happening whereby the workers are attempting to gain representation in political parties, gain representation as state officials, which is a process that, as we've just said, which is aided by capitalism being incredibly productive, at least for periods of this history. The capitalist class needing the workers to be in the workplace producing, but also the state being in a position where it can tax and then use some of that tax revenue to ameliorate the conditions of the working class and sort of stabilize the sort of fractious class relations of capitalism. And then it brings about conditions whereby the form of the appearance of the strike can be one of being non-violent, being respectable, but that's not a result of the nature of the tactic itself. We shouldn't look pejoratively on one tactic and positively on another. It's, as we were describing earlier, a sort of emergent condition of the situation presented by the capitalist mode of production in the world in which we exist.
The situation, the event,
the
thingification of the event. Yeah, I do love like anti-trade union laws out here, where it's like in America, it's, you know, you see the pickets where people are walking in circles because they have to keep moving, but it's like out here, it's like you have to have one person designated as the strike officer, and they have to wear the little green vest, and they have to be keeping everybody in line. It's just like, oh my god, it's so funny. Yeah, maybe not so much the appearance as being very respectable in a lot of cases, but they just are.
Just embarrassing.
Just embarrassing. Man, I was reminded in this, because he talks about it loads and he quotes her a lot, of Rosa Luxemburg's The Mass Strike, and just how impressive of a work that is. Like, maybe one of the few things that's on the Marxist, you want to be a Marxist drop-down menu, what you need to read if you want to be a Marxist, that like you should actually read. It's just phenomenal. The reason he brings her up here is to make the point that, you know, she's around in this period where there was the mass strike going on in the first Russian Revolution in 1905, and people were kind of trying to, you know, socialists were trying to figure out how they need to relate to that as good old merger theory type mass party types, because it was a scary level of like spontaneity that, you know, how does this relate? Rightfully so, how does this relate to social democracy, right? And for all her being painted as a spontaneous for quote unquote defending the mass strike, Joshua Clover here reminds everybody that what she's actually doing in that piece is saying it doesn't matter if you're pro-mass strike, it doesn't matter if you're anti-mass strike, you need to be understanding the mass strike as it's been popping up all over the place as a historical inevitability, of which is part of capitalism's development. And it isn't until we understand why that's happening now, really study that, really figure out why is it that the mass strike is all of a sudden happening, that it can be kind of like used as a tactic, as she kind of argues for, in the broader struggle of like social democracy. And that's just such a important point, I think, in like the broader understanding of studying historical materialism, which is what this book, Riot, Strike, Riot, is all about, right? It's like, okay, here is this thing that we're seeing more and more of, which is the riot. Is it qualitatively different from riots that we've seen in the past? Why is it that we only see riots and minimal industrial action, even compared to like 70 years ago? Why is that? It doesn't matter if you're pro-riot, it doesn't matter if you're anti-riot. Why is it actually happening? Seeing these things as historical inevitabilities, which is like, again, so you want to study historical materialism, that's what you got to do. And, obviously he's coming down on the side here where he says, here's what my study has led me to think. Here's my political prescriptions for the working class or whatever. But you kind of can't really argue with that line of argument, I guess. At least that part of it.
I mean, this is the thing that I've enjoyed most about this book is the nature of its materialist. It's really arguing for a materialist analysis of history, setting the conditions for what is politically possible in terms of meaningful resistance, meaningful political action, and then also having this sort of dialectical structure whereby the process of one thing's transformation into another is sort of like characterized thus, I suppose, as a change from form to content, or like a just an unfolding process, I suppose. So
yes,
that's
the inevitable
yes.
march of history towards general cartel socialism.
Is Riot Prime just like Riot but more Riot?
Yeah, it's quantity into quality. It's quantity of riots into commune. Dialectics, you figured it out.
Mm-hmm.
He sums that up. Go ahead.
I know. Well, I was just wondering whether we should talk about the sort of racial aspect of this, because it's
quite
a significant part of his.
Before we get that, I do just want to read one sentence that he says, where it's exactly what you're saying, where he basically, this is on page 144 of the book, he says, more broadly, normative arguments about what people who struggle should do miss the most basic truth. People will struggle where they are, and our argument is that the people are somewhere else. That's just like, I feel like that all the goddamn time when I, hear Marxists talking about trying to just do 20th century socialism in the face of it failing dramatically. And same with like, petty producer anarchism, shit like that. It's just really sums it up very well. You don't want to normalize the world as you see it. This is exactly what we spoke about with Viv. You don't want to be like, this is what things should be like. You don't want to prescribe to people what they should do. Study what people are actually doing.
Anyway, it's just utopianism at a certain level, then, isn't it? It's just I have a plan. And,
why aren't they listening to me? I have a podcast. Come on. Anyways, what did you want to say?
Oh well, he has an argument for Riot Prime being, or a sort of description for some of the like racial aspects of the conditions of capitalist breakdown, and they sort of how those effects affect different populations differently, and he's sort of drawing attention to the fact that sort of the non-white population in North America, in the US, where he's sort of primarily situated, has been made into the surplus population of this sort of like failing capitalist mode of production first, and sort of the burden of that is falling disproportionately on African Americans and other minority groups. And so the Riot Prime, as he describes it, sort of takes on this appearance as being a potentially sort of racial phenomena. But again, he's sort of like drawing the connection between that, or drawing that back to the sort of like material base and saying, okay, this is sort of like a surface level phenomena appearance thing, but like what's actually happening is that the key economic process happening is the growth in the surplus population of the world, in effect, and sort of permanently surplus in the sense that there is no way back into formal capitalist employment or like industrial capitalist employment in many cases.
Yeah. And this, you're right to highlight that, because this is kind of like his whole reason for kind of lauding the riot, at least now, over the strike, is because, again, this is what we talked about at the beginning. He says that, the strike affirms our place in capitalism as workers, whereas the only thing that binds people together in riots, no matter what they are, whether they're like, blockades, whether they're food riots, whether they're, another cop murdered an unarmed black person in the suburbs of America and doesn't get punished for it, whatever they're for, everybody there is involved, is bonded through one thing only, and that's the fact that they're dispossessed of all means of production, dispossessed of anything, really. Oftentimes, even the ability to even negotiate their labor power because they're unemployed, right? With, as you say, no prospect of ever like finding real-time employment. And capital tries to white out over this by introducing gig work or something like that, and being like, look, these people are steadily employed, but it's incredibly tenuous, or different things like that. Yeah, it's interesting. It's proletariat versus working class kind of stuff, where they're definitely lauding the idea of the proletariat, which is united in dispossession and not in pay cuts every year, right? Yeah. Only other thing I wanted to say is, well, I guess we should talk about the commune stuff, because his point here is that he finally gets into like maybe not prescriptive. Well, it kind of is actually a bit prescriptive. He stops being descriptive, and at the end of the book tries to outline the political prospects for the age of Riot Prime. And he basically just says it's all leading toward the commune, which would be really cool. That'd be really cool if that's happening. I was kind of confused whether he was trying to use examples like Occupy and the Oakland Commune and different things like that as hints of the upcoming real commune, where people who are so dispossessed of not just the means of production, but of anything in capitalism, need to get together to do things for themselves and
ensure social reproduction.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the way he defines it. Like,
yeah. So if that's the case, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, great. If that, I guess that is communism, right? Like it
is commune building. Hey, there you go, man. Cool.
I mean, yeah, I did wrestle with this a bit because I didn't know whether to be like really skeptical. Obviously, there's a big leap being made. I hadn't really put two and two together and said, well, like Occupy is the commune kind of thing.
I think that's probably not the case.
That's probably not what he's saying. Quite, yeah. But imagining a process whereby these conditions of the breakdown of capitalism and what it's doing for the prospects for social reproduction, how people are going to respond to that, the prospect of, well, I don't know how Riot ties into this exactly, whether Riot is just like breaking the, it might not even mean anything but the way you just described it was actually felt quite felt very true, but it also felt very much like Riot ceased to be a particular concrete strategy and becomes a hallmark of conditions of existence for the contemporary proletariat kind of thing. All that then means, I suppose, is like resistance to capitalist dispossession, I guess, is going to take certain forms which are minded toward attacking or intervening into capitalism, once again in the realm of the circulation of commodities and goods. I don't know then how that intervention, except for the fact that potentially you could imagine it possibly building relations of solidarity and communality, social reproduction becoming a collective process that sort of like is outside of social relations as we recognize them under capitalism. Like, it's a perfectly fine image, I suppose. The critique then is not that, but just the lack of a concrete description of that process, and how you build a strategy for intervening to bring that about, I suppose.
Well, to me, it's almost like, so what does Riot Prime have to do with it if in the meantime there's just going to have to be a like guerrilla civil war? You know what I mean?
The use of the phrase civil war multiple times at the end of this, I didn't really.
But I mean, that is the
understand
logic. That's like the implicit logic. Is that's what, like, presumably if what he's saying, and I don't want to like put words into his mouth. So my interpretation of it was, you have all of these riots. They're confronting the state. ... Somehow the state is overcome. ... Social reproduction. ... The commune. Which to me is like, yeah, a massive civil war. Yeah. And at that point, it's like, what does the riot have to do with that? Surely they're different. Like, if you're like a Maoist, surely you'd just be a Maoist. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's like, the thing that bothers me about a lot of this stuff is that it really almost it isn't. But it verges a lot on accelerationism insofar as it seems to be fetishizing the worst things of capitalist society. And that isn't what he's doing. He's being much more nuanced about it, but it kind of sometimes feels like it, you know what I mean?
Given that such a big portion of his analysis, given that a portion of his analysis is describing the strength of the state, which the proletariat under conditions of Riot Prime are violently engaging, I guess, and being met in turn with greater violence on an everyday basis, not just under the extreme conditions of Riot. I mean, it just raise the question, like, can you take on the contemporary state? You know,
which makes me feel like that must not be what he's saying. But what is he saying? I don't know.
I guess the same question is raised for any revolutionary political strategy.
Yeah,
you know, like,
yeah, sure. Unless you do entryism, in which case, then you just become the people with the clubs. So, you know, whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
Revolutionary. Yeah, we need revolutionaries in the army. Is that what? That's what it is.
Indeed, we need revolutionary generals. That's drill sergeants. That's what we need. There you go, Dan. Joshua Clover. There you go. No, but there's one part in this book that it's the only part of this book that I was just actively like, oh, that is incorrect. That is just like, I don't want to be a dick, but it's like, that is actually just wrong. That is like an incorrect interpretation of like Marxism, because most of it, like, you can't really argue with what he's saying in the sense that it's like, well, maybe we will get communes, maybe we won't. I have no way to fall one way or the other on that, because I got no idea, and there isn't really a way to argue with that. But at one point he says, and this gets into the whole proletariat versus working class thing, right? Which I think is a very like important point to make. It's actually made in similar ways in different. The point is made in different ways in like McNair, which I actually think is very funny. But he says, communism in the present no longer able to be conflated with worker command over production and distribution in the socialist mode, is the breaking of the index between one's labor input and one's access to necessities, the twin social activities regulated by wage and price respectively. It may preserve production and consumption in a general sense, but it does away with the mediations that bind production to consumption. Only then are the compulsions of value that organize social relations broken. That is just like, that's just wrong. That's just like, again, I don't want to like come down too hard on the guy, but this is something that really frustrates me, because like, the proliferation of different sects and brands of Marxism, like, really hides the fact that a lot of the general assumptions are exactly the same. And like, this is just a Leninist argument. This is just an argument about socialism versus communism, hidden in like vague things about communism happening immediately, but also it doesn't happen immediately and you have to suffer. The thing that like people just aren't willing in a lot of these sects to come up with a definition of communism, period, and they're just willing to completely defer that question. Communism isn't when you break consumption and distribution. That's high communism. It even drives me nuts because it even like cites the critique of the Gotham program where this is explicitly explained. Communism is communal property relations. Like, that's it. That's what communism is. It's like you get past private property because you like have communal ownership of the means of production. How you organize that is another set of questions. But to say that communism is no longer about worker control of the means of production because you want to make some point about dispossession and stuff is just simply isn't true. And value isn't broken because you break the need to measure labor time and like at first control access to tie consumption and production to a certain extent. The thing that makes that communism is the fact that you're treating everybody's labor the same. And like this idea that value is only broken when you get to high communism is wrong. And like, you know, as I think people will see on the show, I'm like very willing to just like be open to different interpretations. But like this isn't an interpretation. This is just incorrect. And it's something that like pops up all fucking over the place in communization. This is kind of what communization is built on, is this idea of like, we don't know what communism is, dude, so it's high communism. That's it. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's just, it shows such a misunderstanding.
I guess it just mystifies the entire process then. It's sort of, it's both communism is infinitely far in the future and also some kind of spontaneous thing that we create almost immediately without having to know how we're going to do it or what it means.
And will happen regardless of what we do. It's like, but it's frustrating because like that comes across as very anti quote unquote programmatist and very anti like Leninist social democrat. But the thing that frustrates me so much and what I'm trying to say is that like this just is the exact same assumption of Leninist like Marxism, of Marxist Leninism, which is that we defer communism to some point in the future and you only get it when you've been good and when you've suffered, which is that's Lenin's argument.
Yeah, the two options are either you be a Leninist and actually you just advocate for a social democratic program, or you be a communizer and you actually just argue for some kind of anarchist magic where it suddenly turns out that everybody deep down actually already knows how to be a socialist or a communist or whatever.
And I think using the word anarchist is actually really good because it comes across as just like, it's kind of just petty producerism. It's like everybody will do their thing and somehow it'll form a commune. It's like, it's just, it's like all of these people are just Leninists. Everyone's a fucking Leninist. And it drives me so nuts because the whole point of communization, the thing that I find so attractive about it sometimes is the fact that they're like, no, you need to have communism from day one. That's the process of communization is immediately following the revolution. This is what Dovey and all those people say. And it's like, for fuck's sake, it's like the one thing that's going to get you there. Because that's absolutely true. And this is what Marx says, is that like, it's all communism, dude. It's all communism. Until like, it doesn't matter the breaking of consumption stuff where you stop measuring labor time or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's communism when you do and it's communism when you don't.
And it feels like another aspect of the accelerationism, right? Like we need capitalism to destroy the world enough that we don't have to reckon with the fact that we have a massive global production system that we somehow have to work out how to continue doing, you know, exactly. But under changed social relations, that change conditions.
It's very annoying. It's very, very annoying. Like, you remember when we read the Jasper Burns piece in Endnotes 5, and the end of it is like a story basically about how this process all unfolds, and it's like a fictionalized account of how it unfolds. And it's like the most kick-ass adventurous stuff you've ever heard in your life. But then it's like, wait, this would fucking suck. It's like, this would be the worst shit ever. And like, maybe that's where we're going, but like, it's just, people want to do everything other than figure out what communism is. And it's just like, that's like the only thing you should be doing. Like, come on. Whatever, dude. Anyway.
All right, rant over.
Good book. I did actually really enjoy this. And I think that, like, going forward, I'm going to carry the, like, you know, his marriage of Brenner and Arrighi and this idea of, like, riots being the language of dispossession now. I'll look at them differently. It's still a question of like how to make all of these different seemingly disconnected struggles, how to connect them. But we'll get there. We'll build a commune one day, you know? We'll see. Shrug. Well, all right. Well, if anybody's going to the Historical Materialism Conference, in theory, Dan and I are both going, and that's still very much in theory right now. We're probably going to go for the Friday to go see the panel that Tom O'Brien's organizing. So see some of you there, which would be very nice.
Yeah.
Cool. Why not?
Exciting. Yeah, hopefully that can happen.
Hopefully, yeah.
We'll do our best. We'll do our best.
We'll do our best. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I appreciate the historical materialism people organizing their conference to start at like 10 a.m. on a weekday. That's really cool of them. Thanks, guys. But what are you gonna do? Anyways. All right. Well,
right. It's been fun.
We'll be back with something next time, I suppose.
Yeah.
And with the results of the election, Dan. Oh my
yeah.
God.
Maybe we just won't acknowledge it doesn't happen. Yes.
That's what we usually do. So.
No, expect extreme hysteria from us, regardless of who wins.
Yeah, exactly. I'm building my commune 6 feet underground in a metal container. So.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Dan. See everybody later.
Thank you, Jack. Bye-bye, everyone.
Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.